Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in so many layers of turbulent change that I've stopped trying to count them. This show started during the early days of the pandemic, and then along came Ukraine, climate change always in the background, and now the Trumpian moment, which is becoming more than a moment, at least for the moment. I haven't paid attention to the White House. I guess there was doing some live event today to prove he's alive. And his approach to climate, no surprise, is like a wrecking ball. The science, the funding off the coast in Rhode Island, where I grew up, a multi-billion-dollar wind project, almost complete, is now stopped, and it's unclear where that's going to go. In the meantime, the Secretary of Energy commissioned this report in July that came out in July from 5 climate curmudgeons, people who have some kinds of publishing records in relevant fields and or in climate itself, but all of whom have sort of staked a claim as at the very least, contrarian. And now a batch of scientists have come out with a report, a review of the review of the review. And so, Pam is here too. I'm going to bring you in right away, Pam.
Okay.
Pam, can you tip your camera down or something? You're almost, I'll move myself to the bottom.
Let's scoot back a little bit.
And I'm always forgetting how you pronounce McElwee or
McElwee.
McElwee.
Yeah.
Who has been on Sustain What years ago, talking about forests in Guatemala, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, indigenous people's protection of forests and how it contributes to climate change mitigation. Yeah.
Right, and Pam is a contributor to this 85 plus author critique of the climate change critique of climate change science. So I want to start right away. First of all, thank you all for spending some time here today. It's a very busy day. You've just launched the thing. Bob,
I think here.
Say again.
It's just great to be here.
Well, I'm glad that we've connected. And Bob, you have to get off fairly quickly, right? I think so. Maybe we start with Bob Kopp, who I've known forever, on the climate beat, particularly in the context of climate of sea level rise, but also Bob helped convene a meeting at Rutgers years ago on climate emergency, the policy and science questions around that. Bob recently was part of a paper pushing back on tipping points and how that's used or abused. And you're one of the prime people who devoted a lot of time to this, along with Andrew Dessler, who's at Texas A&M. And as I just said, Pam McElwee, who's, did I get right, at Rutgers. McElwee. Yes. So Bob, let's just start with you. I'm going to ask each of you, why did you devote time to this? Why is this time, quote unquote, different than maybe other times when there have been these kinds of pushback?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say, right, we had a 1 month review period. More than 85 climate scientists and other experts came together to produce this detailed 450-page review of the DOE report. So I think we're clocking in at almost 3 times the length of the DOE report. And right, we had only August to do it. So why did 85 people give up a month of their summer vacation to work on this? Well, I would say, like, if this had been, say, the Heritage Foundation producing it, I don't think we would have. What matters is that this is a Department of Energy report, a U.S. government report. And it's a Department of Energy report that the first time most of us heard of it appeared in the EPA's proposed rule purporting to overturn the fact that climate change is a danger to public health and welfare. Right. And so, those two things, the fact that it, as somebody who's worked for the Department of Energy, I was unsettled to see our agency's logo on the top of this document. But the fact that it carries the imprimatur of the U.S. government and that it is being used in policymaking means it merits a report that just a bunch of 5 old scientists, respending things they've been respending for 20 years
Right.
wouldn't on its own.
Yeah, Steve Koonin actually has an Energy Department email address now. He's
Yeah, back at DOE. He was
Yeah.
there when I was there too. Yeah. So that's the next of it. Like this matters because it's a statement of the U.S. government. Otherwise, it wouldn't matter.
And so let's just quickly go down up the chain here.
Yeah.
Andrew, you're essentially the lead sheepdog and bulldog, I think, in this. So what drew you in, and what makes this different, and why go there? Why? Just same question.
Right.
Why?
Yeah, I mean, I guess all of what Bob said applies to me also. I would just add that, I did not go into science to make money. I didn't go into science to push my liberal agenda. I went in because I love science and I respect science. And science it's my life. I've literally devoted my life to understanding the science. When I read the DOE report, I saw a report that does not respect science. It is a mockery of science. And I just thought, this offends me to my core that people are passing this off as science. I had to respond. I didn't know what that form of the response would be. I just sort of said, I have to do something. And so I put out on Blue Sky something like, is there a coordinated response? Who's doing it? And I didn't realize that I was volunteering myself when I said that. But, a bunch of people came back and said, oh, I'll help. And I thought, okay, well, if there are all these people that will help, because I think a lot of people felt the same way I did. I said, let's do it. It's arguably our responsibility as scientists. They want to debate. We'll give them a debate.
Yeah. And Pam, so over to you. Again, your focus on land use change, as you were saying a minute ago, indigenous management, traditional management of land as it relates to sustainability for forests and for various parts of the world. What pulled you in, and just a little detail on what role you played. I'm not going to scroll through the whole report to get to your section.
Yeah, I mean, I had the same response as Bob and Andy. It kind of offended me that I've spent so much time working on climate assessments through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity. Like, we do these assessments properly. They take years. They take large groups of scientists. We debate all of the findings and dig into the research. And to have this come out as a federal report without respecting and following all of those science assessment processes, it made me angry, because we as scientists follow those rules when we do these type of assessments, whether it's a National Climate Assessment or an IPCC report. And to have this DOE report not do that was, as Bob and Andy have said, kind of offensive to me as a scientist.
Yeah. And, frankly, I'm going to show a slide that I've posted periodically, just backing up from the specifics of this report to what's been going on with these issues. As a journalist on this beat for 40 years, when Trump 2.0 got into high gear, and you started seeing press releases from the Environmental Quote Unquote Protection Agency hailing deregulation. And obviously we know there are problems with regulations but there's something about the brute blunt force instrument aspect of what's going on that it just brought me back to not just, a lot of people talk about 1984, but it brings me back to Ray Bradbury when the fire department was running around with flamethrowers instead of water in their hoses. It really is a profound, this year has been, I think, a profound jolt. And I don't know whether that's also part of what fuels you all. Maybe Bob, and then.
I think you're muted, Bob.
I have a thread on Blue Sky that I've been keeping for 3 months or so. At this point, I think 40 different things this administration is doing to dismantle the climate research and climate knowledge infrastructure of this country. This DOE report, I think, is iconic of that. If perhaps less then sorry.
That's okay.
If less destructive on its own than, say, the defunding and firing of our federal scientists.
Yeah, turning off satellites, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whoop, sorry. Are you still there?
I'm still here. Yeah.
Yeah, we're all here.
Yeah, Andy, you know, I mean, again, this goes beyond just this report. I just wanted to sort of touch on that idea.
Sure. I mean, let me just say that science is one of the great energizers of our economy. You know, why are we the leaders in AI? Why are we the people who are making medical breakthroughs? Why are we the, you know, did we develop the first GPS system? You know, it's because of research in government labs, and you know, the Trump administration is proposing to cut. We'll see what actually gets cut. Funding, and it's going to shut off the flow of PhDs. And we're not talking about climate science here. We're talking about all science. And so, I mean, unless you think that the U.S. has too many PhDs, which would be insane, then I think you have to think that all of these attacks on science are not going to help us. And it's not going to be an immediate thing, because we have enough sort of PhDs and innovation in the bank that, you know, maybe it'll be 10 years or 15 or 20 years. But you already see, for example, in clean energy, China is absolutely killing us in automobiles, like EVs. Yeah. China's killing us. And this is going to, as we cut off doing science, they're going to do more and more of this. And the New York Times had a really good article about, you know, the authoritarian playbook on killing science. And so I view this as just sort of another part of that, but one specifically also tailored to help fossil fuel interests. Yeah.
So let's get back to the report itself. I mean, your report on the report. You've posted some takeaways. There's a press release. I had the shortcut link here. I'll throw it up in a second. How important is it to do the detailed deconstruction, which sometimes feels like it's almost playing into the game?
Yeah, no, that's
because,
really
as you know, there is gray space. You know, these are not yes or no questions.
No, I mean, that's a good point. And several people sort of said, you know, if you do a detailed point by point response, you're essentially adopting their framing of the problem, which is crazy. But on the other hand, we had 30 days. I want to make sure all your viewers appreciate how little time that is, and how that really indicates that the DOE is not interested in any kind of legitimate debate. Assessments have to give much longer time for that. And you need to go through multiple rounds of peer review to do multiple rounds of peer review. And, you know, they didn't do any of that. And they give people 30 days to respond. And you know, it's hard to write a comprehensive response in 30 days. So what we have is sort of the best we could do. I think if we had more time, we could have had 500 authors writing 2,000 pages. And, you know, there are inevitably going to be some errors in there, as we said in the SPM. We already found a sentence, Bob and I did, where we wanted to say something is not true, and we left the word not out. So, I mean, these errors are just, I mean, there are going to be errors in there. And I hope the people who say we want to debate don't get hung up on, you know, there's a typo in this sentence, or, you know, this one thing is wrong. If they want to debate, they got to debate. So treat the debate seriously. I'm feeling that they're not going to do that, though.
Well, yeah, I mean, this, sorry.
So, and yeah, I mean, just to jump in and say, I mean, we have to remember there are two audiences, at least, for this report.
Least, yeah.
Right. Well, let's just say, again, I actually found it really interesting, and I learned stuff from this process. And I think Andy has said he had as well. So I think there's like a legitimate scientific value in reading this document. But one is to communicate to the public and to policymakers that the DOE report in the form it was released at the end of July is not sound science. It is biased. It's full of errors. It's not fit for policymaking. The other, and then, you know, again, this is why the fact that this is a DOE report and not a Heritage Foundation report matters, is that it needs to be completely clear in a court of law that this is DOE report does not actually, you know, is not a stable foundation on which for EPA to build one of the two pillars of their purported finding that climate change does not endanger health and welfare. And that for me, at least, is why this, you know, 450-page response is worthwhile. You know, there are more concise ways of making that point in the public arena, but that those more concise ways don't make clear necessarily in a court of law how the document is.
Yeah, and I think in a way that will come out because they're the Union of Concerned Scientists, Environmental Defense Fund, others are already gone to court 2 weeks ago to try to get an injunction on the application of this.
Yeah, and I want to add on because you put this quote up. Highly influential scientific assessment is a term that has a meaning in the U.S. government.
Mm-hmm.
It's an assessment. I think the threshold is that is used to inform decisions with more than $500 million worth of impact, which certainly the endangerment reconsideration would be. And one of the requirements for a highly influential scientific assessment, and that's been there for requirement for all this century practically, is that it undergo an unbiased, transparent scientific peer review by with the iconic representation of that being a group like the National Academies. And not only do we not know of any plan by DOE to do this, EPA is actually relying on what it acknowledges as a draft version of this report. So even if the plan for the DOE report were to do the sort of peer review that is legally required, EPA is relying on a pre-review draft version of it. So there's multiple reasons why the way this report is used just does not stand up.
And I'll just add that nobody has seen publicly the draft version that the EPA was citing, so we don't even know what it says. It's probably similar, I'm guessing, but who knows? Yeah,
I want to bring up Roger Pilkey Jr., who I know is a hot button name for some folks, but he's done a lot of peer-reviewed work on, especially the disaster interface, the work on emission scenarios with others. And he's just posted today an initial look at the review of the review. And there are, just as you were saying, I mean, you did a shitload of work in a month. And it would be shocking to me if there weren't some errors somewhere in there. One of the ones that I do think is supported by certainly my assessment of this, the world weather attribution work, the climate attribution science was from its roots designed and conceived to help support litigation. And your report does say it's kind of the opposite. And I don't want to make this like an echo chamber kind of thing, but like here, this was Climate Wire, Maxine Jaslow, who's now at the New York Times, had quoted Frederick Otto, who saying exactly that. Unlike every other branch of the climate science or science in general, event attribution was actually originally suggested with the courts in mind.
Well, look, let me address that. I think it would be unimaginable that climate, delayers and misinformers wouldn't go through this and try to find these things. Now, I haven't seen those. I was reading the page though. And I mean, if that's the best argument that they have against a 450 page document, like you said, it was not designed for litigation, but it is. I don't know enough about it to have a theory. In our document, every writing team was responsible for their material. I don't remember exactly what they said, but I mean, there's going to be a lot of chaff and a lot of people trying to change, muddy the water. That's the whole point of this. So let me just remind all your viewers, what are the important things to remember? Okay, the Earth is warming. Humans are to blame. It's right now having an impact on extreme weather. We're expecting much more warming, geologically significant amounts of warming, and the impacts of that are unknown. Now, if you want to talk about whether some attribution method was designed for litigation or not, go somewhere else. I mean, that is not a meaningful part of this debate. And I think people need to, if you see someone just trying to spin up mud to muddy the situation, you got to call them out on it.
Bob, you have any thoughts on that? And you might be, I think
you're muted, I think.
Obviously, Freddie Otto's in the best position to talk about her work. She's not the originator of the field necessarily. So I think you should look at what the origins of it are. I first clocked into the field, the topic, and with Kevin Trenberth's work 10, 15 years ago. I don't recall litigation being necessarily a part of it. Perhaps it was, but also that irrelevant.
Well, I mean, I think the meta point here is that there is agenda-driven science on the other side. And I know Steve,
but it's science.
I know. Yes,
iterative, critical process of science, right? Regardless, people pay money to do biomedical research that is motivated with the goal of having medical solutions. That doesn't mean that folks down the road from me at Johnson & Johnson aren't doing science. The question is not whether they're doing it to make money or whether they're doing it by giving up their summer vacations. It's whether they subject their work to the iterative process of publishing the results, submitting it to peer review, letting other people critique their peer review. And this report simply doesn't stand up to that process. And much of the claims in it have already been published and they've already been rejected.
Yeah, no, that's why I don't want to necessarily harp on this. But to me, one of the key points that I've been trying to make, and this is from their original report, and I've talked to Judy Curry and Christy for many years about these things, and what they did here, the great uncertainties about these many factors may make it impossible to precisely predict future emissions.
Correct.
As if that's a reason for sitting on your hands. And that's I've seen that forever. And then the other thing that bugs me from that end of the spectrum is they're very happy to have it appropriated and exploited by the policy world, the Senator Inhofes of the world, to do nothing. Right. And they sit back and kind of bask in the glory of their skepticism, their self-described skepticism.
There's a figure in the climate economics part of the report looking at the studies DOE cites for social cost of carbon versus all of the studies published in the literature, right? And what it shows is sort of indicative of what they try to do throughout the report, right? There's a distribution of things in the literature. They're focused on the ones all the way down here. The middle of the distribution is here, and there's a tail over here of really bad possible outcomes. They don't talk about the ones over here. They just say, okay, well, this is where the middle of this, and then here, if we handpick these studies, they suggest it's less than that. But in fact, right, the median of the literature is somewhere around here, and there are studies down here that they pick on. And then there's this really long tail of potentially very bad outcomes, which they would prefer we not look at.
Right. So the hope here, and also you did submit this as a review. I mean, it was submitted formally into the federal record as well. Is that right, Andrew?
Yes, that's correct.
Is it Andy or Andrew?
Either's fine. We submitted to the DOE, and we're going to submit it to the EPA. And we also submitted to the national academies.
Right.
So we spent all this time writing it. We're going to get as much out of it as we can.
Absolutely. No, I think it's a very creditable effort. The other thing, some people, Matthew Burgess, who may pop on here in a little while, in Wyoming and others, have been trying to press the administration. Just if you are remotely serious about any of this stuff, then do a national climate assessment.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, that's the obvious choice. If Chris Wright really wanted to understand what the science was, there are several things. He could have asked the national academies. The George W. Bush administration did that, or he could go to a website and download the National Climate Assessment in 2 minutes, and he would have an assessment that does all of there are rules about how you do a good assessment. It follows all of them.
Right. And here's the submitted version. So, do you think there's any? When I wrote about this the other day on my blog, and I kind of pushed back on Matt and Rogers made this point too, and I say, yeah, that's all fine in theory, but I cannot see any way in the world that I've seen evolve in recent months that the administration would do that. Do any of you have any sense that that's?
I don't think that you can think about that. That's not. When I go to give a talk about climate change to like a Rotary Club, I don't say, "Is this going to change the debate?" You do it because it's the right thing to do. You do it to defend science. I mean, I did this to defend the second love of my life, science, after my wife. So maybe third after my wife and my dog, and then science. So that's why I did it. And it doesn't matter that I agree with you. I think that they're going to do everything they can to avoid having to actually engage in an actual debate. If they want to engage in a debate, the scientific community is there. There are rules that have evolved over the last 100 years about how you engage in debates and how you get ideas accepted. And they could do that. They could do a legitimate assessment of rules. Right. But I don't know. I do not know what they're going to do. It'll be really interesting.
And is there any hope in Congress, as you've all mentioned? I mean, a couple of you mentioned, the budget process is still yet to play out. Historically, there are Republicans who have defied presidents, but this one seems pretty anomalously undefiable. Do you think in Congress, is this being sent around to congressional staff as well? I assume.
Yeah, we did send it to some people, asked for copies, and we sent around. We told them feel free to circulate it to other offices. So the people that want to see it, we're happy to share it with them. And the hope is that it gets read by there.
Hey, I just noticed Matt Burgess was in the green room munching on some carrot sticks. Just kidding.
Almost true, actually. Can you hear me?
And has joined us. Matt, you're at the University of Wyoming?
Yeah, University of Wyoming.
And could you just explain your perspective and what you study and just kind of...
Sure. So I study political polarization of climate change and a bunch of things, including scenarios that I would broadly characterize as macroeconomics, either of or adjacent to climate change. Partly because of my work on polarization, and maybe partly because, as a pretty middle of the road Canadian, I sometimes find myself passing for a conservative in academia, and I've gotten to know some of the leaders of the so-called eco-right movement. So I just last week, I think, joined the advisory board of the American Conservation Coalition, for example. I guess I would say I have some appreciation and some respect for the, maybe more right of center position on some of these issues. I also have a lot of respect for science, and so I find this process pretty frustrating, right? In terms of, as I wrote about on my blog, it's if you just kind of read Secretary Wright's letter in isolation about why he was doing the DOE report, there are some things that I agree with there, right? Maybe we need to open up the envelope of lines of evidence and perspectives we consider. But if you think about the larger context that we scrapped, a 700 person or something author, 2 to 3 year national climate assessment for this 5 author 2 months thing, and we're destroying satellites and we're defunding climate science. We're trying to zero out, NOAA's climate science part, for example. It just, you can't take it seriously as an effort to actually have the debate. But I think as a matter of public discourse, for sure, and in many cases as a matter of science, it's worth having the debate, right? Obviously, from a scientific perspective, all we care about is what's true and not true. But on the other hand, if you've got a large fraction of the country that believes something, I think you want to have that out in public, kind of regardless of whether or not what we think about it as scientists. I also think there are areas where the notion that maybe there are blind spots. I don't like the word bias because I think it kind of assumes nefarious motives, right? But for example, my former colleague Max Boykoff had a survey that found that I think slightly more than 80% of climate scientists identify as liberal or very liberal. There was, I think, a larger fraction identified as radical than identified as conservative. There's a survey that found that 40% of professors nationally identify as one of radical, activist, Marxist, or socialist. And there are some specific areas we can get into where, again, I don't think it's bias. I just think it's blind spots where maybe there are, some what Lee Justin at Rutgers would call selective calls for rigor, or just, overemphasis on some things, underemphasis on other things. Obviously, the scenarios is one thing that I've written about. I think there's kind of reasonable perspectives there, but I think for that reason, I find this process with the DOE and the APA very frustrating. And I know, I won't name names or kind of divulge my sources, but I know a lot of conservatives that share my frustration with this, where it's like, we could have, if the Trump administration thinks that, say the last NCA had blind spots and biases and could use more diversity of perspectives on certain topics, that's great. But then do another NCA and make it an adversarial collaboration. There's even a model for this at the University of Pennsylvania called the Adversarial Collaboration Project, where they get people who are on opposite sides of hot issues to work together on either new experiments or review papers that reflect some kind of consensus. And they've been, I think, really effective. And they've taken on some really hot issues, like there was one that came out recently on, gender bias in science, right? So sort of where areas is there evidence of bias against women, where is there evidence of bias against men, et cetera, et cetera. So you could do something like that for climate change, and you could do it within the context of the NCA, which is this congressionally mandated thing that we already are supposed to do. And on not only that, I think from a conservative perspective, if you were worried about the next administration likely being a Democrat the way things are going, doing an NCA that has the biases that you thought the last NCA had, whether or not you're right, then you would be better off, I think, doing the NCA, because that's the thing. If, as I think Andy maybe said a second ago when I was listening, like, if you think that you have an underappreciated argument that can win the day, then make it, right? And destroying satellites is not the move of people who think they can win the argument. So it's obviously, offensive to what you might call the mainstream perspective that they're doing this, but I think it's also offensive to the perspective that the people, authors of DOE and others, have a point in some areas, because you're sort of not acting like somebody who has a point, even though maybe in some areas they do. And just really quickly to end, when I was looking at the DOE report and the EPA, I'm sorry I haven't had a chance yet to read this new response. 450 pages came out this morning, but I'm going to get to it.
What are you doing? What are you doing if you haven't read all 450 pages?
But so the DOE and the EPA report, I want to be very careful to stay in my lane and kind of not talk about areas that I'm just really not an expert in. But on scenarios in economics, I would say the DOE report got the facts of scenarios basically right and interpreted it, I think, closer to maybe how I would, but maybe differently to how other folks like Zeke Housefather would. And I think on economics, it made some important points, for example, about uncertainty being underappreciated and kind of the cost side of some policies being underappreciated. But there were definitely some areas where it got over its skis. Like, I think at one point it said that there's the weight of evidence is that there's a positive effect of climate change on poor countries, which I would say the opposite is true. And then generally the point that's been emphasized before already in this call, from what I heard, is that you can't say things are uncertain and therefore there's no problem, right? Things are uncertain. Definitionally, you don't know that there's no problem. So I'll leave it there and take questions and comments.
This is valuable. And by the way, seeing as Michael Mann is at Penn and Corey Clark's project, I had Corey on my show maybe a year ago, with another scholar talking about self-censorship in science, sort of self-censorship. And boy, we get them both on. He's got a book coming on, so maybe we can get him to talk about it. How do you? But here's my question: who's the referee? Like, how would you actually?
Well, I mean, there's actually a legal process for this. For highly influential scientific assessment, there's a legal process and a standard for review. And those guidelines say the national academies is like the archetypal example of how you do a peer review of a highly influential scientific assessment. That's the process that's been followed for every NCA. It also says, by the way, you're entitled to a substantive response to every point in the peer review. So yeah, I mean, the DOE could have even called, I mean, that what is an NCA is flexible. They've evolved into this 500 author multi-year efforts. Bush administration did something different. Like they could have said, okay, we're going to hire these 5 people to write broadly outside their area of expertise and call it an NCA, but then they would still have to submit it to the peer review process.
Right. So
and
they're trying to.
What we're providing is the peer review that DOE didn't set up the legal process to do for their report.
Pam,
I want to fill the legal requirements, but we strove to provide a sort of unbiased scientific review of this document. We've gotten some generally positive feedback on Blue Sky, but some people say, no, well, you give these groups of people too much credence by subjecting the report to a proper scientific review. I disagree with that. I think it's important.
Well, I think it's done a public service by starting, as you said, we live in a world now where impressions through social media and everything else actually have weight, and you're reminding the world that how this doesn't fit the conventions. It may look like a scientific review, but it's political from its foundation.
And Matt says they made some pointers out scenarios that he's agrees with. I would say, like in the sea level chapter of our review, which I led, I would say they made some points that I would give a B to a student in my non-majors course, but if a grad student had turned in a paper with those errors, they wouldn't have gotten a passing grade. There's just some basic errors and basic definitional concepts that reflects the fact that 5 people can't possibly have the expertise to cover the scope of what they're doing. And, in a proper assessment, this would have had several hundred authors, and you wouldn't see this, frankly, shoddy document put out as a public review draft.
Yeah, I want to bring Pam in again because you've been involved with the biodiversity, the intergovernmental biodiversity effort. There's the IPCC. I know, Bob, you've definitely been an IPCC author. So at that global scale, Pam, are there lessons that could be applied here, Pam?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Bob and I have been working on in addition to this response is the Trump administration basically didn't nominate U.S. scientists to be part of the IPCC, right? We have been the founding group of scientists. The largest number of scientists have been Americans through the previous assessment cycles, and the government didn't nominate anybody this year. So Bob and I and some other folks got together and ran a sort of non-federal nominations process to ensure the U.S. scientists stay engaged. So again, the points Matt was making, it's like, if you want to debate, why are you closing down the opportunities for people to be on these assessments, right? Why are you closing down all of the data that's collected for these assessments? So we've been working on this behind the scenes. Luckily, our efforts have been successful. So there's around 50 U.S. scientists that are going to be on the next IPCC report. Or the next assessment cycle, which comprises 3 major working group reports. Bob will be on one of the assessment groups. I'm going to be on one of the others. So there's a lot going on sort of behind the scenes, but typically this would be the federal government that would be helping, get folks involved. And particularly since we have so many world-class federal scientists, we were just talking about the DOE report. Why didn't they peer review it? Why wasn't it written by the fact that the DOE has world-class climate scientists at so many of their national labs, right? Why did Chris Wright have to go out of DOE and find 5 people that agreed with his point of view, right? Why wasn't he using the resources of DOE? These are the sorts of questions that sort of raise all of this process issue that we've been talking about, right? It's just outside of the normal scientific processes for these assessments.
Right. So any last thoughts from everyone here? I know it's a very busy day for you all, for sure. Matt, as the outsider, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Bob, and then Andy.
Keep saying it until it happens, or not. But let's do a national climate assessment, right? It's required by law. If we don't do it now, it's going to be done by the next administration. Again, the way things are going, that's probably going to be a Democratic administration if you just look at the polls, although the Democrats have some polling problems of their own. And, I think that there are some issues where an adversarial collaboration would be great. I think, economics cost benefit is one, maybe scenarios is one. Extreme weather attribution, I don't know much about that myself, but you, I think, mentioned earlier when I was kind of listening, the debate between Friederike Otto and Roger Pilkey Jr., right? That seems like a perfect area for an adversarial collaboration on how should we think about extreme weather. If the administration thinks that the uncertainty and cost side of the economics are worth considering more, there's lots of good scientific data and evidence that we can have out on that. I think the last thing I'll just say as a provocation to people on all sides of this is that I don't think that one U.S. administration is going to have as much of an impact on global emissions as people think. There's a kind of a large interconnected global market. There's been some really interesting things that have just come out recently. For example, Africa is having a China-led solar boom, maybe because we don't want to buy their panels anymore, right?
And Pakistan too.
And I didn't see that, but I could believe it. And U.S. emissions have been declining at a basically linear rate, since the George W. Bush administration. The global CO2 intensity of GDP has been declining at a basically linear rate since the 60s. So I guess I think that the stakes maybe are smaller than we think in terms of what the climate looks like, but all the more reason to make the scientific discussion more civil and reasonable and serious, which, I think that I know some of the individual authors of the DOE report, I think they're all earnest, serious people who believe what they believe. But I don't think that anybody really thinks this has been a serious process and we could benefit from one.
I do too. Again, finding the space for that in the world out there, at least as a governmental process, will be really hard. Bob?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. So one time I'm responding to Matt, what you keep seeing in this space, and we saw it in New Jersey with coastal adaptation, is that the people who don't want to regulate greenhouse gases or don't want to invest in adaptation are just choosing because I think it's because maybe it's more confusing to audiences to attack science, which has been well established for decades, rather than to have the argument on the grounds where there is actual disagreement. For instance, talk about sea level adaptation, right? There's a legitimate debate, not a scientific debate, but a policy and values debate about how much to value the future and how much to value risk. And that's the grounds on which you want to be having the discussion, not, what critics often seem to do, which is to go to the science and attack that. So Matt pointed to benefit cost analysis. I think that's a great area for discussion. Whether or not lots of scientific analyses show that it is. The DOE report says, basically we drew some lines through some curves and it wasn't obvious to us whether or not it's accelerating. That's, sort of putting science on one side and vibes on the other isn't how you do this. And I think there are areas, the more you get into policy areas where there are legitimate grounds for debate. But fine, let's have the discussion about, do we care about people who don't live in the United States? I think that or do we care about our grandchildren? We don't need to challenge science that, frankly, some of it was known to the people who drafted the Clean Air Act in presidential reports to Johnson and Nixon. So let's have don't use debate. Don't use fake debates about science to mask real debates about policies and values.
Oh yeah, that point you made about the social cost of carbon questions, like how much you value the future and people outside the country. I had Cass Sunstein on here recently, and we also talked. I talked with him about the values with David Roberts, who's now the Volts blogger. Great, he did a great piece years ago for Grist magazine on how values hide behind numbers. We use numbers to mask what really are values-driven decisions on something like that. So finding those pieces, like Matthew was saying, finding those pieces of the climate prism, defining which ones are values-laden and which ones are actual science is a good starting point. And I think how we do that with this administration in power is still a hard question. I want to actually show something here. It was a long time ago when I first thought of the sea level debate, like how fast is it rising? Or it's kind of like, I used to say, it's like watching a bus starting to roll down a hill in San Francisco and debating the speed of the bus. And I found this recently. Here's a bus full of kids sliding down an icy road. Do we really care if it's going 2 miles an hour or 3 miles an hour?
Can I make one point?
Yeah, please do.
Other point about the sea level example, because this is also a great example. So in the DOE report, what they do is they look at 5 tide gauges of the 150 in the US. They fit lines through them and say, it doesn't look to us like it's accelerating. They don't do any statistical analysis. In the executive summary report, they then say, U.S. tide gauges in the aggregate don't show a sea level acceleration. So they've gone from 5 tide gauges to somehow saying something about tide gauges in the aggregate. In the EPA proposed rule, they say that the DOE report says that sea level rise is minimal. So they've gone from, we fit a line through 5 curves and it didn't look to us like there was an acceleration, to, sea level rise isn't worth worrying about. And that's an interesting chain of telephone that you can see just by comparing the report, the chapter summary, the executive summary of the report in the EPA.
Yeah. Andy?
Well, I'll just say that, when I talk to my students, one of the things I really point out to them is the consequences of this debate, in the sense that we live in a global economy. And if you look at what China's doing, they're going to rule the world in energy and in automobiles. And if they keep producing more PhDs than us, they're going to rule the world in everything. And so I think that even if you forget about climate, this has really profound implications for how, whether we're going to give away, one of the biggest economic sectors of the 21st century, energy, to China. Because if we don't develop it here, we're going to be buying it from them. And it looks like that's what the administration has decided, that we're not going to be competitors in the renewable energy space. And, that's going to be profoundly bad for the future of the US. And not to mention the fact that we're cutting science funding. So we're going to have fewer scientists. We're going to have fewer innovations. I mean, it's really, even beyond the climate, this seems like terrible policy. I'd be curious to know what Matt thought about that.
I agree with the broad strokes of that. One argument that I've heard that's kind of the reverse of what you said about China owning the future is that there's some people who have influence in the administration who I've heard say China has a comparative advantage in renewables because of partly their slave labor, and we have a comparative advantage in fossil fuels. And so the more that the global economy moves towards renewables, the more that's sort of bad for us. I would tend to be closer to your view, Andy, that the world is moving towards renewables, whether we like it or not. And so therefore we should do whatever we can to have the comparative advantage in those. And certainly we can have debates, domestically about what the role of natural gas is over the next few decades. I think that there's reasonable arguments on both sides, nuclear versus solar versus wind versus all of them are all kind of fine to have. I think the one thing, and I totally agree with what you said about we don't want to cut off our scientific capacity at the knees. The one thing, though, that I would say that's not contrary to that, but additional to that, that's sort of a challenge to my fellow academics, is we were enormously losing our public standing and trust for about a decade before President Trump was elected. And so we've got some of our own cleaning up to do if we want to shore up the future of American science, irrespective of what's going on in the Trump administration.
Oh, yeah, I've made that. I first wrote a page 1 story on declining focus on innovation and basic science around climate solutions.
And to my Canadian friends, because I'm Canadian, applying for citizenship in the U.S. In the next year, hopefully.
Oh, really? You're coming the other way? Can we trade? No, just kidding.
Well, I think you can be dual. I would say, to Canadians like, and other countries, Europeans too, if you want to benefit from, the American government's current retreat from science, then you better clean up the same problems that you have that sort of mirror the problems that predate President Trump that are here, and also get your economic house in order. Because right now, Canadian economy is going to have a hard time supporting large investments in stealing American scientists. And I think you could say the same thing about a bunch of European countries. So yeah, there's lots that we can do to get our house in order, irrespective of what happens in the next 4 years. But I think there's a strong conservative case that is implied in some of what Andy said, that we want, if American greatness includes American greatness in science. In fact, something like a fifth of U.S. productivity since the Second World War comes from science, directly or indirectly. Same thing, American greatness comes from leadership in the technologies of the 21st century, which absolutely includes renewable technologies, whether we like it or not. And it may also include, natural gas. I think it certainly does today and probably does for the next few decades. But, let's be leaders if we want America to be great.
Yeah, I'm going to ask two more questions, and thank you all for spending some extra time here. Pam, I'd like to get one more thought from you, but Andy, in Texas, Texas is outdoing California in terms of its own adoption of renewable electricity sources, and it's not a function of who was governor. A big chunk of that was spawned under Rick Perry, of all people. So it's like, do you think there's a possibility that what I would see as overreach by Trump right now in terms of what's happening, it's so surreal, almost comical, almost comic bookish, could finally break some people out of their pattern of thinking they want more of what he's selling?
Well, I think what could happen is the price of electricity could start to go up a lot.
Well, that's it.
We're already beginning to see that because of, just growth in demand. And, this idea that, we're not going to build we're not going to turn on an offshore wind farm that's almost built for some reason. I don't even know what their rationale was. That shouldn't play. People should be mad about that. And I think that we need a lot of power. Solar and wind, we know how to make power from them. They work well. You have to be, as with everything, you have to be smart about it. Make sure you don't create other environmental problems. There's a lot of land, like there are a lot of roofs, a lot of parking lots. There's a lot of space we can put solar panels. And wind is mature technology. You can use the land for other things if you have wind turbines on them. So, I think that could move it. I mean, I've given up trying to predict the future. 20 years ago, when I first sort of started working on this, I thought, there'll come a time, 10, 20 years from now when people look out the window and they kind of see the climate changing and all of these things, just their personal life, they see it. And they'll say, yeah, we got to do something about it. And it's quite clear that's never going to happen. So I was wrong. And I could be wrong about all of my other predictions of how people are going to react. I don't know. All I can do and all I've ever tried to do is support science. And that's what we're doing in this report review.
And also define what is science and what is not science.
Well, science is a process. Science is how we have developed the body of knowledge that we have now. And I think it's important to emphasize how good climate science is. All the successful predictions it's made, essentially nothing happens. It's like, oh yeah, okay, we can figure out what caused this, or we understand this. There have been no big revisions. In a lot of science, someone discovers something and the whole paradigm shifts. That's never happened in climate science. From Arrhenius to the last IPCC, it's just the straight line of increasingly well understood physics. And that's science. I mean, I'm really proud to be part of that community. I understand I'm a very small cog, but I'm part of the community and I'm proud of it.
So maybe the thing to do is to get you back on the Joe Rogan show.
Kids play.
Yeah.
These streets would be just black with coal all the way.
Maybe that's where you could have you and Steve Koonin. Oh boy, that'd be interesting. Would you do it, or is that just perpetuating the same question?
I this way, I didn't want to do it when, Rogan on the show at the very end said, I want to have you both. I thought that's a dumb idea. But, things change. Depending on what sort of the ground rules are, I would be willing to do that now, I think.
Okay, well, let's see. Pam, thank you again for your time. Any last thoughts on where we go from
Yeah,
here?
I mean, I think it's interesting that all of us that are on this call, we're all at public universities. And so to respond to this idea that there's this decline in trust around science, I think a big part of that is a concerted effort by bad faith actors on the right to attack higher education and science and so forth. So I don't think it's all about we have to clean up ourselves here. But I think all of us on this call, the reason we're here is we see public engagement as being important, right? And I don't want to speak for everybody else, but I talk to high schools, I see being at a public university is about engagement. And you can actually see for a lot of folks, like their big state universities, there is a lot of trust. They do recognize the economic benefits that these state universities bring to the state and the region and so forth. And so I think in some ways we have a sort of special, maybe amplified role that we can use to kind of continue to foster that trust and do things like this so that people are sort of understanding what it is that climate scientists do. And have debates over policy, but not the underlying science where there's clear evidence and data, right? So this whole question about what action should we take and which ones are less expensive and which ones are more expensive? Sure, that's a policy question, right? But this idea that sea level rise is not happening or, disasters, we can adapt to them because we've adapted in the past, right? They're all sort of extrapolations or outright falsehoods, and they don't really engage in that policy debate that we could have. So, I hope this report sort of lets people know that the strength of the scientific foundations is there. And if we want to have discussions about how we respond to climate change, that is a discussion that a lot of us are willing to have, but it has to be based on agreement that climate change is serious, it's happening, and we should do something about it.
Well, this has been a really valuable discussion. I'm really glad you could all spend the time. And Andy Dessler, it's good to finally get you on here.
It's
Bob,
a long time coming.
Yeah, Bob, it's great to reconnect with you. And Matt Burgess, good to meet you.
Yeah, thanks.
Unless we met at University of Colorado a long time ago, maybe we did.
Can't remember. I don't think so. I think I just missed you, but we corresponded about nominating some of my colleagues for awards. But I won't go into details, but I do want to push back a little bit on the notion that the trust problem is externally manufactured. I mean, there certainly is an element on the right that has wanted to foment mistrust with academia, and that's been going on for decades. I think it's worth asking, why has it specifically been over just the last decade where it's worked? And I think you can point to a lot of things that academics ourselves have done to take ideological and sometimes partisan postures. I won't go into the details, but I've written about this a few times. One of them is this blog post called "Partisan Science is Bad for Science and Society" that I wrote with Roger Pilkey Jr. a couple years ago. I do think there's a real thing there, but certainly I would agree that public universities in red states included, I'm in the reddest state in the country, right, have a lot of trust, do a lot of great things, have a lot of public good, full stop. So there definitely is a difference between the Ivies and some of the flagships, but I do think there is a there in terms of the academic trust problem, and I think we're just gaslighting people if we deny that.
Well, that's a whole nother show. I've done several on trust and science, including climate science, 3 or 4 years ago. So this is great. This has been, I'd say, chapter 1 of a dive into a very valuable effort, Herculean almost, effort by 85 plus scientists to try to articulate what is and is not scientific in the report that the Trump Energy Secretary commissioned from 5 longtime, I will call them climate curmudgeons, people who are smart and have done some work that's valuable and some work that's questionable, like so many of us. And there's so much more to go here. One thing I think is really important is to get at this question of, is there some pathway from here to an actual assessment that has the full legal bearing and influence that it should have? And that's something to get at for sure. That model at Penn University, at the University of Pennsylvania that Matthew talked about, absolutely. I want to get into that adversarial collaboration. I've done shows here before with Peter Coleman. Peter Coleman at Columbia runs the Difficult Conversations Laboratory. And one thing that he taught me when I was at Columbia is what you don't want, you're not going to end up with agreement. What you want is cooperation. When you have deeply divided parties, and his work is all from like Middle East diplomacy. This applies everywhere. It's just great to have you all here, Pam at Rutgers, and everyone. Good luck with your next stretch of work on this, and then comes teaching that too. Take care. This is Andy Revkin. This has been Sustain What, and we'll do more on this going forward. Reviewing the climate science critique done for Team Trump. Take care, everyone. Andy, if you could stay on for just a second.
Sure.
I was on Lex Friedman's show. I've not been on Rogan, but maybe that's another area. I haven't been in touch with him in a couple of years, but maybe you could find some way to get some of this revived in that arena. I think there's some value there.
I mean, he went on this rant about this Washington. You leaving, Matt? All right, bye, Matt. He went.
Yeah, no, I saw that, and actually,
Washington Post article, and I actually emailed the booker, and I said, "Hey, if he wants to have someone on to talk about that, I would." And he goes, "I'll ask him." He goes, I'll ask him. I'll get back to you if he's interested." And I never heard back from him.
Yeah,
so sure. He's not. My sense is that he actually doesn't want to talk. That he doesn't want to talk about climate change. He seems to have a pretty conspiratorial view for whatever reason.
Yep.
But I don't know the guy.
Yeah, well, I don't know. This is as we were saying earlier. I really don't see anything productive happening with this White House.
I agree. This idea that we should do a national climate summit, it's a great message. We should keep pushing, but I mean, they're obviously not going to do it. They're obviously not going to do anything that has any credibility, just because it wouldn't give them the answer they want. You know that. Yeah. So,
I mean, just last thing, when I wrote about Bush, George W., when he sent a letter to the National Academies of Science in 2001, March, asking them to lay out the uncertainties in climate science for him. So it was a report, and of course they had to kind of do what they were asked to do.
Right.
And that's not productive either. It was good to talk to you.
Yeah, no, good. Okay, good seeing you.
Take care. And by the way, this is all